So today I'm going to present, I guess, the work of some of the research I've been doing reading about, where I believe there are some misunderstandings about melatonin. So firstly, I want to present this multi-step argument to you, which is the first one is that a bright blue enriched LED screen 1 hour before bed, that's the first part. Second part is suppresses the nighttime hormone melatonin. The next step being making it difficult to fall asleep. So that's a very common multi-step argument that you can find anywhere. I seem to find it in my social media feeds every day. But just going back to 2021, which was when I presented this particular talk at the Behavioral Sleep Medicine seminar that's run by Michael Grandner, not to be mistaken for myself. And in that particular seminar, I was basically focusing on the first part and the last part. Basically, this concept that a bright blue enriched LED screen 1 hour before bed would make it difficult to fall asleep. Now, in that seminar, basically what I did was collate all of the studies, experimental studies. These are done in a lab or done at home, and really try to have a look at the evidence for if you manipulate having a bright screen in the hour, at least an hour before bed, to some sort of dimming of that screen or having a reduction of the blue light from that screen, whether it's with glasses, whether it's just reading a printed book or having an app. What is the effect on the time taken to fall asleep? And this was the table that I presented in that particular talk. On the left-hand side, you can see there the author, year chronologically, different designs that have been used in terms of research design, different measures, whether it's polysomnography, which is electrodes attached to the scalp, or actigraphy, the sort of scientifically validated wearables, whether they were done at lab, at home, whether the intervention, like I said before, printed book, blue blocking glasses, or an app, how long it took them to fall asleep when they had a bright screen, and critically, the final right-hand side column there is what was the extension? How much longer did it take to fall asleep when they had a bright screen? And if you can really cast your eye down that right-hand side, there really isn't a huge difference. In fact, if you average those numbers, it's probably close to zero, if not just on the positive side. So, sort of talking about a few minutes of extra time taken to fall asleep, which is nothing to really write home about. So, I really felt like the internet was saying one thing, but the data that was in different scientific journals and different studies, if you could put it together, was telling a different story. And from that seminar in 2021, and spearheaded by Serena Balduco, we thought it's really important that we had to get all of this data and put it into one place in the scientific literature. So last year, sorry, it's actually 2026 this year. So now in 2024, we were able to publish this particular review. And it was really sort of having a look at the theories and the mechanisms that might link technology use and sleep, and noting that it's not necessarily in one direction, that people can have sleep problems for different reasons. And if you have a sleep problem, sometimes people then go to use technology, but it doesn't necessarily mean technology caused the issue in the first place. And so in that paper, we have this particular table right there. And one thing we mentioned in this particular review was the following. What is equally interesting is the consistency of melatonin suppression seen across studies. These data suggest an uncoupling of the tight connection assumed to exist between pre-sleep melatonin levels and sleep onset latency. So in other words, what we're seeing, I guess, in these studies is that they are consistently reporting in the face of having a bright screen that they're getting significant reductions in evening melatonin levels. But despite that consistency of a decreased melatonin level, we're not seeing that it's taking longer to fall asleep. And here's one example here. This is a paper that was recently published in 2022. And with this particular study, what they managed to show is that you can get melatonin suppression, but that doesn't necessarily confer an extension to other aspects of sleep. So here they actually mention that we observed suppression of melatonin by roughly 14% in the high compared to the low melanopic condition. However, conditions did not differentially affect sleep, one of those aspects being sleep latency. sleep quality, sleepiness, or vigilance. So it's really, again, an example of this uncoupling between melatonin suppression in the evening and sleep. So what I want to do today in this talk is really, I've focused on steps 1 to 3 and said pretty much we can't see that connection there. And that connection is often made with the rationale that melatonin is suppressed. So now what I want to do is I want to focus on the connection between step 1 and step 2. Do you actually get this reduction or the suppression in melatonin from having a bright blue enriched screen in the 1 hour before bed? Now, if you look at various studies that have really tried to manipulate the brightness of a screen or basically the amount of blue light coming from that screen, and you see this across many different studies, you can have a look at the abstract. Sometimes you can have a look at the title, and they will report that there is a significant reduction or suppression of melatonin, evening melatonin, in the presence of a bright blue enriched LED screen. And these are some examples here where you can see in this first study, 5 hours exposure, 2 hours exposure, and 1.5 hours exposure was able to suppress evening melatonin. Now, what's interesting is that in these studies, when you look a little bit closer, there wasn't actually melatonin suppression that was observed after 1 hour of screen use. So keep that in mind because what we often hear is that you shouldn't use technology in the hour before bed. And the reason being is because of the bright screen, because of the blue light, because it suppresses melatonin. But these studies didn't actually show suppression. So, say, for example, that middle study in 2012, after 1 hour, they did not see significant melatonin suppression. After 2 hours, they did. In 2015, this particular paper looked at half an hour sequences of melatonin. After half an hour, they did not see a suppression. After 1 hour, they did not see significant suppression of melatonin, but after 1.5 hours, they did. And in the 2011 study, they pretty much looked at this in terms of after 5 hours of exposure to a computer screen, and that's when they saw the significant melatonin suppression. So really, I'm going to look at this multi-step argument, and as we sort of go through the evidence, I'm going to sort of change it a little bit because really this concept of it suppressing melatonin after 1 hour isn't necessarily accurate, and it really means that we have a lack of evidence for this whole notion of 1 hour of screen use suppressing melatonin. And we also, I guess, part of this talk is going to be looking again at that divide between the scientific evidence, the numbers that are actually in these peer-reviewed scientific papers in these journals compared to what's being said on the internet. And so this is one example, and this is, if you don't know him, this is Andrew Huberman, who has claimed himself to be a professor at Stanford University, a neuroscientist. And I think when you put those things together in terms of neuroscience professor in Stanford, it sort of implies trust. And what we should really denote here is that he is not necessarily a researcher, at least not necessarily a current researcher, but he was a researcher and it was on mice. Now, it was looking at mice eyes and the cells of their eyes. I don't know how much you call that neuroscience. I mean, technically, I'm a neuroscientist because I study sleep and I study and measure EEG. Therefore, neuro means brain, science means science. So that's science of the brain. And technically, I'm a neuroscience scientist, but to me, it's just a bit too vague. So here we have someone making these claims about evening light and saying that it can quash melatonin levels. Now, when I first hear the term quash, I'm thinking about, well, that's a complete suppression of melatonin. That's the impression I get when using that language. In fact, when I actually put it in ChatGPT, the first time without any context, it sort of came forward or replied in terms of a legal response and saying quash means completely get rid of, obliterate, nothing. But in a biological concept, it really sort of says about significantly suppressing, shutting down, or turning off. So a little bit still suggesting that we have this complete sort of like turning the tap off in terms of our melatonin production when we have evening bright light, or in this case, screen light, which is what I'm talking about. Now, let's actually have a look at these studies who have compared a bright screen versus some sort of manipulation of it, lowering the brightness, whether they've got a printed book or whatever it is. Now, if you look at these studies, and this is the natural rise in melatonin. So the left-hand curve, that's where you probably got your most representative increase in evening melatonin. And so you can see that in the presence of a bright LED enriched screen, that you are getting a suppression of melatonin. I've indicated that by where those red bars are. Those are the differences between having a reasonably normal sort of increase in your evening melatonin versus having a bright screen that might be blue enriched. So you can see that there are points across that curve where it is significantly suppressed, but it is not quashed. It is not completely gone. If anything, it's a small amount. As a reminder, again, from that Bloom and colleagues study in 2022, that there was a decrease of 14% of melatonin in the evening. And some of these would suggest it could be somewhere between 14 to say 25%. So it's not a complete suppression of melatonin. That's one thing also to note in these studies. So if we again look back at this multi-step argument, we're talking about not necessarily having 1 hour of bright screen use, we're talking having about 1.5 hours of continuous use, if not more. And we're talking about having suppression. Actually, when I did record or have some sort of estimate and measurement there, we are talking about in some studies you're getting sort of roughly 14% up to 58%. So it's not complete suppression or quashing of melatonin. But let's sort of continue along these lines. Let's have a look at the brightness because in these studies, you really need to have completely bright screens. So we were the ones that conducted the first study, really looking at this concept. Could a bright screen make it difficult to fall asleep? So on those previous slides where it said Heath et al., that was actually our research group. And when we tested the bright screen prior to data collection, we noticed that the amount of light coming from that, the intensity of light measured in lux, the amount of light measured from the eye, was actually quite low. And I say quite low, and I should say relatively low compared to, say, what we would consider bright light that would have a real significant impact on sleep and circadian rhythms. The background here being that when we've done evening bright light therapy to purposely change someone's circadian rhythm timing, particularly people that are falling asleep too early and waking too early, which means they might have advanced sleep-wake phase disorder. That's when we provide evening bright light. And we're talking about at least 500 to 1,000 lux in the evening to try to purposely delay their circadian rhythm so that their circadian rhythm sort of allows them to sort of fall asleep a bit later, which is a more socially acceptable, and wake up a bit later. So instead of waking up at 3 a.m., they're waking up at 5 or 6 a.m., which is more acceptable for them. When you look at these studies, you can see here that the amount of lux coming from a computer screen, tablet, they're actually relatively low. We're only talking about 105 lux, 31 lux, and 58 lux. Nonetheless, if you are to do this, it is incredibly bright and somewhat definitely uncomfortable, if not painful. So I don't really believe that people would be exposing themselves to a completely bright screen for 1.5 hours or more that is predominantly bright, which is what is done in these studies. So I guess what I'm saying is that it's really hard to sort of see how these lab studies are translating to the real world. And this particular paper that was published by a group of experts in light and circadian rhythms and sleep, really titled their Melanopic Irradiance Defines the Impact of Evening Display Light on Sleep Latency, Melatonin, and Alertness. They have this one phrase here, which is the usual light levels experienced in the evening are relatively low compared to daylight. So, for example, computer screens are approximately 80 lux, tablets 40 lux, smartphones 20 lux, and watching television 10 lux. Now, I've got a background in doing research on pre-sleep technology use and sleep. And really, when it comes to the commonality, or I should say that the most common devices that people are using in the hours before bed, they more often than not are smartphones and they are TVs. That's what essentially the data are showing. So therefore, you're talking about low lux levels here. So they're not really bright enough to be able to significantly suppress melatonin, especially if they're not up full brightness and if they're not used for considerably a long period of time. So, really, looking at this multi-step argument that needs to be modified, you need really frickin' bright screens, at least for 1.5 hours, to be able to get some suppression of melatonin. But the story gets even more interesting. Now, in these graphs, when it comes to melatonin suppression, there was something in these graphs. If you look at the first one in 2015 with Vanderlei et al., as well as the one by Kaoken and colleagues in 2011, they have this period before the bright screen exposure, which is a dark adaptation. Now, the reason being is that when you've got people coming into the lab and you are exposing them to different lighting conditions, whether it's basically a bright screen or a dim screen, for example, then what you need to do is that you need to be able to sort of get them to sort of have their eyes reset. And one way you do that is to actually have this period of dark adaptation, which can be sort of 30 to 60 minutes. In a similar sort of fashion, this study that was done in Harvard by Chang and colleagues, what they did is that they had people in the laboratory for a considerable amount of time. In fact, it was for a period of 2 weeks. And during the day, they had people in 90 lux. Now, 90 lux throughout the entire day is really low light levels. Like office work sort of levels of light should be around about 150 up to 500. And certainly when you're going outside, you're getting exposure to light that should be sort of in the thousands. So it's highly unusual that people would do this in the real world, that they'd be exposed to 90 lux completely during the day for 2 weeks on end, or that they would sort of go to work, come home, and then they'd basically have 30 to 60 minutes in the dark, and then they would get on their screens. So what happens is that this dark adaptation, as you'll see, it basically starts to sensitize the biological systems to the light, making it more likely that you'll get melatonin suppression and maybe affect sleep. There was one study, though, that didn't do it. And this was by Rungtel and colleagues in 2016 in Sweden. They did not find significant melatonin suppression in response to basically a bright tablet that was 102 lux, and they had no dark adaptation. So what we're saying here is that they didn't follow these sort of protocols. They didn't have this dark adaptation, which is probably what happens in the real world. They had continuous bright light exposure around about 560 lux up to like across the afternoon up until the evening. They did not find this significant melatonin suppression. And that's after 2 hours of using the bright tablet. So they should have seen that, and they probably would have seen it if they actually had this period of dark adaptation. And this is not necessarily new stuff. So back in 2015, in response to the Harvard study that was by Chang and colleagues, Jamie Zeitzer in PNAS, the same journal that the Harvard study was published in, he basically wrote about the fact that it's really important to consider someone's prior light exposure during the day because that can have an effect on the sensitivity of the biological system in response to light. So, for example, a couple of statements here. We and others, including Chang and colleagues, have demonstrated that non-image forming system compares light exposure patterns such that the impact of the light one receives at night is moderated by the amount of light one receives during the day. Real life light exposure desensitizes the non-image forming system to the intensity of evening light exposure that was examined in this particular study. So he noticed this and mentions it in 2015, over 10 years ago. One of the authors from the Harvard study even admits this as well in a podcast that happened a few years after the study, mentioning, and this is the quote, and also what your previous light exposure history has been, sort of talking about the different factors that can influence how much light has an effect on your sleep. And giving this example, so if you've been at the beach all day and then you get an evening light exposure, you're going to be less sensitive to that evening light exposure. So people recognize this, even the researchers recognize that depending upon how much light you get during the day, that will affect how sensitive you are at night. So for example, you get light exposure outside during the day, especially if it's going to be in the afternoon, as demonstrated by the Rongtel study, then you're going to have less of a chance of having significant melatonin suppression in opposite to that, if you look at the Harvard study, and if you're indoors and you are exposed to low levels of light throughout the entire day, and then you are having a fully bright screen, then you have the chances of having that sort of significant melatonin suppression. Why is this the case? Well, there's this concept known as photostasis. Now, it's about sort of balance, and it's very similar to, in some ways, sleep homeostasis, which is what we have as one of our main theories in sleep. So, sleep homeostasis is basically sleep pressure. It's this balance that you get. The longer that you are awake, the higher the increase in the pressure to sleep. And when you sleep, then that pressure is released. So, it's always trying to find some sort of balance here. So, photostasis, in terms of a definition, is gradual changes in the retinal structure and function whereby the sensitivity of the retina to light is slowly altered to ensure the absorption of a constant number of photons per day. So, light is made up of photons. So, say, for example, if you have a certain amount of photons that you are supposed to receive, and if you're, say, for example, like in the Harvard study, exposed to low levels, 90 lux throughout the day, you're not really filling up your quota of photons. And then what happens is when you're exposed to a bright screen, that's when the system is really prepared to take those in and use them. And it does create this alertness and affects sleep and melatonin suppression, I should say. But in contrast, if you are filling up this quota, you are getting enough light exposure during the day. What it means is the extra light, this evening light that you get, doesn't necessarily create this melatonin suppression because of this concept of photostasis. So this really relates back to what Jamie Seitzer was saying, which is thus the question still remains as to whether the light being emitted from an e-reader or any other type of electronic device would actually impact nocturnal alertness and sleep in normally behaving individuals. Normally behaving individuals being people that actually go outside and get more than 90 lux during the day. Now, this Harvard study was a really well-designed study. Unlike all of the previous studies where someone would come in, say, for example, on a Tuesday of one given week and be exposed to one of those conditions, it might be the bright screen. The following week they come back and it might be the sort of dim screen that they get exposed to, or vice versa. What happened in the Harvard study is that people came into the lab and for 5 days in a row, they received the same condition. So it might be sort of the bright e-reader for 5 days, and then the following week, after a washout period over the weekend, then they'd be exposed to this printed book, or the other way around. So it was more sort of like science imitating life in that sort of respect. So because it was so involved, it's very expensive to do. You need to have really good sort of facilities to be able to do it. It makes it quite difficult to actually replicate that study. But one way you can try to replicate that is through mathematical modeling. And by doing mathematical modeling with the right sort of models, it means that you can actually therefore start to repeat this. Like, what happens if we sort of did the Harvard study 1,000 times over? What would be the sort of aggregate or the average amount of change that we would see? So this is one example here. And I should say that this paper is under review currently, and hopefully it does get published because I think it adds an important aspect to this conversation. And so, what it suggests is if you were to repeat this study many, many, many times over, you would actually indeed find that when it comes to sleep latency, that you would find that there is an increase in the time taken to fall asleep, an average of 14.5 minutes if you compare a printed book to an e-reader. Now, what they found in their particular study was a difference of 9.9 minutes. So it's very close to those sort of conditions. Now, the other nice thing about mathematical modeling is not only can you repeat and replicate potentially a study, but you can also change some of the parameters. Like, say, for example, what if we were to repeat this study many, many times over, but instead of people being in 90 lux during the day, what if they were in sort of like a higher amount of lux? And therefore, by the theory of photostasis, they're actually filling up their quota of photons per day. By the time they actually get the e-reader at night, they're less sensitive to it. So this was actually performed in this particular paper. And what we see is that the difference between the time taken to fall asleep between the printed book and the e-reader then goes down to an average of 5 minutes if people were in 500 lux during the day. Again, this supports that theory of photostasis. So this isn't necessarily melatonin suppression in this particular paper, but it's a similar sort of concept, really looking at the impact of evening screen use on sleep, melatonin, circadian rhythms potentially, depending upon prior light history. So, really, when you sort of factor all of these different concepts together that have been done in these published studies, and you try to apply it to the real world, you have to ask yourself this question. How many people stay indoors all day under dim light? After dinner and washing up, they sit in darkness for at least 30 minutes, if not 60 minutes, get on their device and turn the brightness up to max, hold the device about 30 centimeters from their face for 1.5 hours or more, and do all of those things every single freaking night. Now, if you try it yourself, I think that's probably the best experience. Like especially if you try to sit there in the dark for 30 minutes not doing anything and then you put a bright screen in your face, like a tablet for example, on a white screen, full brightness and have it 30 centimeters away from your face. Think about how long you would keep that iPad in front of your face for 30 centimeters away from your face, full brightness. Would you actually do that for at least 1.5 hours? It then that I think that experience will allow you to sort of create that realistic doubt that the translation of these scientific data to the real world is is in doubt. It really is in doubt. What we're hearing again on the internet about these screens affecting melatonin suppression, I don't believe that's necessarily happening in the real world. So therefore, the first misunderstanding about melatonin, I think it is unlikely that the melatonin suppression from screens and lab studies applies to the real world. That's the first one. I'm going to move on to a second one in a moment, but what it probably means then is that if we look at this multi-step argument, you need really fucking bright blue enriched LED screens for at least 1.5 hours before bed that will suppress the pineal melatonin by 14 to 58% after dark adaptation and or low daylight levels. This is the formula that you need in order to get that melatonin suppression. Even if you do, it's unlikely that it's going to make it difficult to fall asleep. So here is I guess, a lead into the second misunderstanding. And this is really starting to sort of understand endogenous melatonin. And this is an example here of melatonin that's sampled either via the plasma, which is blood, and that's the sort of black one there that shows that robust circadian rhythm where you've got sort of nothing that's happening during the day, and then you've got this big peak of melatonin that's happening just after midnight, and then it's coming down just as morning is approaching. People have hopefully heard about that. But those little white squares, that's when you are measuring it from the saliva, which is a very common sort of method used in studies. So you can still see a circadian rhythm there, but it's not as much. Now, when it comes to melatonin and endogenous melatonin, as a circadian rhythm researcher, I did my PhD in circadian rhythms in 2005, so over 20 years ago now. And basically, I believed that the melatonin that was produced in our body primarily, if anything, 100% of it came from the brain, from the pineal gland, which sits right in the center of the brain. But I read this paper here a couple of years ago, and it completely sort of changed my way of thinking about melatonin. And so I really recommend people look this up. You can actually go to Google Scholar, type in this title, and you can actually read this paper. It is free to read. There is this one statement, I should say, set of statements that are early in the paper that I'll read out to you here. In addition to those of pineal origin, organisms have three additional sources of melatonin. Extra pineal sources of melatonin include the mitochondrial melatonin potentially produced in all other cells, tissues, and organs, and that from microbiota, as well as from diet. Indeed, Zhao et al. Speculated that the pineal gland accounts for less than 5% of the total melatonin produced in mammals. So I was led to believe initially that the pineal gland produced 100% of our melatonin in our body. But this is really stating that it's probably far less than that, something somewhere between 5 to 10%. As it says here, unlike pineal melatonin, that portion synthesized in these elements is mostly not released into substantial quantities into the blood or the cerebral spinal fluid, but rather is used in the cell, which is why during the daytime, when you look at that previous graph of the circadian rhythm of melatonin, you're not necessarily seeing high levels there because what it's proposing here is the majority of the melatonin is contained within the cells, and therefore it can't be measured because it's not outside of the cell, therefore in the plasma or the saliva, therefore it cannot be necessarily measured. There are some further statements here that are quite interesting. So the findings suggest that most cells synthesize their own melatonin, so the cells of our body. This has been identified in all cells tested, including neurons, glia, astrocytes, thymus, heart, kidney, spleen, lymphocytes, oocytes, testes, placenta, skin, and gut. And then it goes on to say, due to its size, the gastrointestinal tract contains approximately 400-fold amounts of melatonin relative to those present in the pineal gland and in the circulation. So when it comes to this sort of change from melatonin being produced 100% from the pineal gland in our brain to 5%, that sort of reduction from 100% to 5% is probably mainly due to the fact that this statement here about the gastrointestinal tract and the cells that basically make up the gastrointestinal tract are producing their own melatonin that's contained within the cell. This is 400 times the amount of melatonin that's produced in the pineal gland is what this is stating. And as you can see, it's got a couple of citations there. So how does this actually work? So basically, the melatonin is produced in the cells, and within the cells are the mitochondria. And the mitochondria are basically within the cell, the intracellular space, and they're producing this melatonin. Now, I can't actually read that because that's actually in the way. But the point of this is that the melatonin are there not necessarily for sleep and circadian rhythm issues, but more so that melatonin is used for other purposes. And one of those is that it helps to scavenge free radicals that are known as what are they? Reactive oxygen species and nitrogen reactive species. So these are basically toxins or oxidants, and therefore melatonin is an antioxidant. So melatonin is used from the cells, or I should say within the cells, and the mitochondria are using melatonin, they're producing it themselves, using it as an antioxidant to be able to protect not only the mitochondria, but also the cell from these toxins that essentially can disrupt the cell function and even the cell membrane. So this is a real change, at least for me, in the past couple of years, understanding that melatonin is far more than just circadian rhythms and sleep, but also an antioxidant. And more on that later. So one statement that's also mentioned in this paper is that melatonin is a multifunctional antioxidant with several unique characteristics that distinguish it from the classic antioxidants. For example, one molecule of melatonin may scavenge up to 10 oxygen reactive species or nitrogen reactive species, whereas a classic antioxidant like vitamin C only scavenges one or two such reactants. So I looked up the paper that they're referring to here, and this is the one here, interactions of melatonin and its metabolites within the ABTS Cation radical. And sure enough, there is this implication that, and in some ways, it's not just melatonin, but like it says, it's metabolites as well. So melatonin, one molecule of melatonin can basically deal with a few to several of these toxins or these oxidants. And then the metabolites, what basically melatonin turns into, then they can deal with further oxidants as well, and it can basically range up to about 10 of these compared to one or two that it can deal with in terms of, let me say that again. So vitamin C can deal with one or two per molecule, whereas one molecule of melatonin can deal with up to 10 if you're also talking about melatonin and its metabolites. So really, that's also a very fascinating thing because people sort of often think about antioxidants, they think about vitamin C, but not many people know that melatonin can actually be a highly potent antioxidant. Now, in saying all that, this is why it's always important to keep up with research. This idea that there is a ratio of 400 to 1 when it comes to gastrointestinal melatonin versus pineal melatonin is now in question. So this paper was done as a review 1 or 2 years ago, and it's done by Dave Kennaway. Anyone that knows Dave Kennaway knows he's a melatonin expert. As his title says here, the mammalian gastrointestinal tract is a knot. a major extra pineal source of melatonin. I like the fact that he capitalized not there, like it's, he's very angry about this or something like this. But what he does is that he basically lists all of the different studies that have looked at this. And some of the initial studies, which is really around the same sort of study, are sort of saying that the ratio is around about 400 to 1. But the more studies that came out, you found that the ratio was far, far less because of the different ways and the different methods that the melatonin was being sampled. So it really now changes or casts doubt in this whole ratio of 400 to 1. Therefore, it probably then casts doubt that pineal melatonin accounts for 5 to 10% of our total production of melatonin. What he says here at the end of his abstract is using the more contemporary results, we can calculate that rather than 400 to 1 ratio of gastrointestinal to pineal melatonin, a ratio of 0.05 to 0.19 to 1 is likely. So this is why it's always important, I guess, to sort of keep up with the research and sort of see what is really coming out. And also, like what Dave has done, really dig deep into a concept and sort of see what is below the surface of an abstract, look at all the different sort of papers and try to bring everything together. So really, I guess the second misconception about melatonin is that extra pineal melatonin exists in the human body. So I think for a lot of sleep and circadian researchers, they think melatonin is primarily just from the pineal gland. There is doubt cast in that now that we understand that melatonin can be produced in the mitochondria of the cells of our body, but the percent of that now is in doubt. It might not necessarily be the fact that it's 95% to 90% produced outside of the pineal gland. Who knows where it is? It's got to be somewhere between, I guess, 95 to 5%. So I think that's still to come, and we should keep our eyes peeled for that sort of thing. Now, moving over to the third and final misunderstanding about melatonin. There was a study that came out. There's been a couple of studies really that have come out, and their translation of the data to the public via social media or the media, the traditional media, I think have really demonized melatonin. And when I'm talking about melatonin now, I'm talking about exogenous melatonin or melatonin supplements, not necessarily the melatonin within us, but the melatonin that we can buy on the shelves or get from a pharmacy. So you got phrases like this, like from Time Magazine, melatonin overdoses among kids are up 530%, new research finds. Or reports of melatonin poisoning in kids have spiked dramatically. Melatonin warning after two children die. And here, a colleague, Matt Walker, saying that there's been an increase in poisonous overdose admissions to hospitals of melatonin. This was recently done or mentioned on the Diary of a CEO podcast, that has like 13 million subscribers, and here it had over 1 million views within a couple of weeks. So these messages are getting through to a lot of people, but I don't think that they're necessarily correct or accurate. Now, this is the actual report that it came from, which is pediatric melatonin ingestions from the United States between the years 2012 to 2021. So this is a period of 11 to 12 years. And this is from this particular paper. So during 2012 to 2021, a total of, well, pretty much over a quarter of a million pediatric melatonin ingestions were reported to poison control centers. Most children, 84%, were asymptomatic. So, firstly, we've got this report about this massive increase of 530%. They're sort of termed in terms of like poisonings and overdoses and so forth, but these are not poisonings or overdoses. These are actually just phone calls to a poison center, and 84% of that, over a quarter of a million, didn't actually have symptoms. Among the 28,000 patients who received care at a health facility, 19,000 were discharged, 4,000 were hospitalized, and 287 required intensive care. Among all melatonin ingestions, 4,555, 1.6% resulted in more serious outcomes. Five children required mechanical ventilation and two died. Now, I want to focus on the fact that yes, it started out with 260,000 phone calls. And within that, you had two children that died, and we shouldn't minimize that. That's a really important, like every life counts. So this is really important. This is why we should look at this very critically. But so therefore, as much as I think that melatonin is being demonized, we still have to have an open mind about what is going on in terms of melatonin and its potential for harm. Now, I will say from my side of the fence, when this paper came out in the 2020s about these melatonin ingestions going up and so forth, and the fact that two children died, you have to understand that these two children died. The primary reason they died was mentioned by the coroner, who said that it was due primarily or even solely due to melatonin, not due to anything else necessarily. So I was nonetheless still skeptical, and these are the reasons why. Back in probably 2016, give or take, when I was training a particular clinical psychologist, Dr. Guritsa Micic, we had this case come through of an infant who was 13 months of age, and it was an unusual one where the parents had really tried everything. They had tried every sort of type of technique that you think you could use, even extinction, where you basically place the infant in the cot, you make sure that all of their needs are met, and then you leave them, and then you basically go to them in the morning, and you do that night after night after night. The evidence for that, regardless of your opinion of how harmful that is or whether you do that or not, personally, I wouldn't do it, and I wouldn't recommend that, even though it has the evidence behind it. They tried this, and that didn't work for this particular family. So, as a clinical psych myself, I was only left with like, well, what tools can I teach this particular family? And as much as I had used melatonin for young children, like say, for example, 2 years and 4 years of age, I remember a case very specifically. I hadn't gone as young as 13 months of age. And so I basically tasked Gritzer with a homework assignment saying, okay, between now and next week when we see this family again, I want you to look at the evidence and see what is the youngest age in the scientific literature that an infant has been given melatonin. When Carissa came back, she was, well, the answer is 0 days, basically newborns. And this is the particular study that she looked up. So in this study, there was using melatonin for newborns who had sepsis. So this was also opening up, I guess, my eyes back then, but I didn't pay enough attention to it, that melatonin could be used as an antioxidant and an anti-inflammatory. So in this particular study, what happened is that they gave these children, they had 10 children with, or I should say newborns, who were born with sepsis, and they gave them standard care. There were 10 other newborns who had sepsis. They were also given standard care, and they were also given melatonin. What it says here is that 3 of the 10 septic children who were not treated with melatonin died within 72 hours after diagnosis of sepsis. None of the 10 septic newborns treated with melatonin died. So, on the one hand, we've got that previous study where we're talking about 530% increase in poisonings and overdoses due to melatonin. And when you boil down and you look at the numbers from that 250,000, you've got two children that died. And that is important. They died. The reason they died, I think that should still be looked at, because you've got this other paper that says 3 children were practically saved. Their lives were saved by having melatonin. But it sort of doesn't stop there. So this particular paper on the left-hand side was done in 2001. Up until last year in 2025, there's now been enough studies to sort of pull all of the data together to do a meta-analysis. And this particular paper is saying the efficacy of melatonin as adjunctive therapy, which means alongside standard care for sepsis. And this is not necessarily just in newborns, this is also in adults. And it basically says here 7 randomized controlled trials, which collectively involved 421 patients diagnosed with sepsis. Melatonin reduced mortality and C-reactive protein levels. The included RCTs did not separately validate the potency purity of the melatonin used, which could lead to potential bias. High quality articles and larger sample sizes are needed. Very standard, stock standard sort of stuff. But what is it is suggesting at this point is that melatonin has that potential to basically save lives. Now, going further back, this is a book basically by a guy called Russell Reiter, and basically, if you look him up in Google Scholar, you type his name and the word of melatonin. I don't know how many pages of studies you will see with his name on it. He is like the #1 person when it comes to knowledge about melatonin, and he wrote a book in 1995 labeled melatonin. And in that book, early on, he's talking about the discovery of melatonin and really then sort of going about, okay, we have to go through the usual processes here of saying, finding out, is melatonin safe? Is it, or is it toxic? The sort of similar concepts here. And so, really, one way, and I think it's the way that people basically do this, is to really give it to rats. And they give it in higher increasing doses to a whole bunch of rats. When a certain dose reaches a point where it kills 50% of those rats, that's called the LD50. So, lethal dose taking out 50% of those rats. As it says here in the book, the researchers, try as they might, the researchers could not determine the LD50 for melatonin, even though they injected mice with as much as 800 milligrams of it being melatonin, per kilogram of body weight, which is far more than what a human being is usually prescribed or that you can buy in terms of melatonin off of the shelf, really. So what I'm leaning towards here is that melatonin doesn't have a toxicity level that could be established, whereas other compounds could. And this is the original paper that it was published in Nature in 1967. So, looking at another highly mentioned study when it comes to melatonin, and we're going now down the track of looking at sort of melatonin that you can purchase off the shelf, especially, I guess, when it's unregulated and it's in the United States. So, we're not talking about pharmaceutical grade melatonin. Also, considering that a lot of these studies that have been done in terms of randomized controlled trials, if you're giving melatonin to a newborn with sepsis, you're going to use pharmaceutical grade melatonin. It's not going to contain anything else. This particular study was looking at melatonin and various different types of melatonin, I should say, whether they're gummies or whatever that you can get off the shelf, and looking at how much was mentioned on the label versus how much was actually in the melatonin, and seeing if it was purely melatonin or if there are other things here. And it's this sort of statement here that's mentioned a lot, which is in the abstract. So the results showed that melatonin content was found to range between minus 83% to plus 478% of the labeled content. And it's that plus 478%, sometimes rounded up to plus 480%, that is mentioned so much in social media and elsewhere. If you actually go down deeper and read the paper and you go to this particular table, this is the sample where it showed this 478 percent more in the chewable tablet than was mentioned on the label. If you look at the number of milligrams there, which is the green bar, this is 7 milligrams more than that was reported. So it was reported to have 1.5 milligrams of melatonin, but it actually had 8.67 milligrams of melatonin. Also note that it had not just melatonin, but it also had L-theanine and 5-HTP. Also note that both of those compounds do have an LD50, melatonin does not. So, going back to that 2001 study where melatonin was given on top of standard care for newborns with sepsis, looking at the finer print here, 10 septic newborns were treated with the antioxidant melatonin given within the first 12 hours after diagnosis. 10 other septic newborns in a comparable state were used as septic controls, while 10 healthy newborns served as normal controls. A total of 20 milligrams of melatonin was administered orally in two doses of 10 milligrams each within a 1 hour interval. So going back to the previous one, that was okay, 478% more, but it was 7 milligrams more. The implication is that that's bad. Here, you've got melatonin given to a newborn who is suffering from a life-threatening disease, and they're given far more than 7 milligrams. They're given 20 milligrams of melatonin. And these are newborns, okay? This is not necessarily like in other studies where we're talking about pediatrics, which is under fives. So for some reason, we've got melatonin, which is being demonized in the media as being a bad thing. You don't necessarily see this with magnesium or L-theanine and so forth, but you find this with melatonin. And so my concern is that potentially we are demonizing something that could save lives and it's gone in the complete opposite direction. So again, there's this disparity between the evidence and the data that are contained within peer-reviewed journals and what has been mentioned on the traditional media and social media. I want to sort of go through some other sort of examples here. This was a general sort of study looking at basically what's called high dose melatonin, which is having 10 milligrams or more for various different medical conditions and what are the problems with it. And this is a meta-analysis as well. So pulling all these different studies and all of the data into the one paper. As it says there, melatonin did not cause a detectable increase in serious adverse events. That's what SAEs mean, or withdrawals due to adverse events, but did appear to increase the risk of adverse events such as drowsiness, headache, and dizziness. But we're not necessarily seeing all of these serious harms coming from it. But it's not just necessarily sepsis that melatonin can be helpful for. You will find that melatonin currently, if you look at the published literature, is being used for a whole range of different medical conditions. This is using it as an adjunct therapy with your traditional therapies for cancer, that being chemotherapy or radiotherapy. I said or, but sometimes for some cancers it can be and. This is a meta-analysis back in 2012. And this is where they are providing melatonin on top of radiotherapy or on top of chemotherapy. As it says here in the results, melatonin significantly improves the complete and partial remission as well as 1 year survival rate. And so these are studies where people are given either just chemotherapy or chemotherapy plus melatonin or radiotherapy only or radiotherapy and melatonin. So it's that randomized control trial dramatically decrease the radiochemotherapy related side effects such as neurotoxicity and fatigue. So this is melatonin again showing that it can actually be quite helpful when we are faced with a serious medical condition. What's really interesting with this meta-analysis is if you look at the table and you look at all of the characteristics of the different studies. Here, I've got an example here of the populations. This is across a whole range of different cancers. So you've got lung cancer, you've got brain cancer, you've got colorectal cancer, that you've got all these different types of cancers. And in one column here, in terms of the dosage, you've got this common repeated thing of having 20 milligrams of melatonin in the evening each day. Again, here we've got this concept of melatonin being harmful in the media, but if you look at the scientific evidence to the point that they've done meta-analyses over a decade ago, you've got actual health benefits and potentially life-saving benefits of melatonin here. And I would say watch this space. There are some murmurings. In fact, there is some research now showing that potentially melatonin could have been helpful for COVID-19, but also now in dementia and neurodegenerative disorders. I find that word very hard to say. So keep your eyes peeled, keep your eyes on the research for melatonin and its potential additive effects in improving health. So this really leads to the third and final one, that melatonin, if anything, it's safe from what we can see from the data, even life-saving. When it comes to those two children that were claimed to have died from melatonin from those coroners, it doesn't match any of the evidence that's coming from other peer-reviewed papers in so many different fields. So it does cast doubt on really the conclusion that potentially those coroners have made. I know that could be controversial, and that would be awful, I think, for the families to hear that. At the same time, moving forward, I think it's really important that we start to do a U-turn and we don't necessarily demonize melatonin. We have to look at the evidence and we have to really start to educate health professionals and the public about what the data is actually saying. And hopefully influencers or anyone that has a microphone and has millions of people that are listening to them can start to really also look at this data and also start to realize that maybe they need to sort of rethink their position when it comes to melatonin. But for now, hopefully that's something that you can do.